I'd like to introduce our first speaker, someone that I have had the honor and pleasure of serving with this almost a year on a group called Seismic Resilience Initiative, dealing with some statewide legislation with Evan Reis, who is the Executive Director of US Resiliency Council. I'm going to read his bio, short bio. He has a much longer bio, but he graduated from Stanford University in 1988. The following year, he was back down on the farm, helping the university recover from the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. As the structural engineer for the retrofit of its most historic buildings, including the Memorial Church and the Stanford Art Museum, the first reinforced concrete building built west of Mississippi. Evan co-founded the USRC in 2011 to educate building stakeholders and public about the gap between the growing sustainability movement and true resilient design. Improving community and regional resilience in natural disasters is a national imperative. The USRC's mission is to educate, advocate, and promote better tools for assessing and communicating building performance in natural disasters and provide data to make better informed decisions on owning, renting, leasing, and insuring properties so that market forces will drive the building design and procurement process towards more resilient building design. With that, please give a round of applause for Evan Reis, who came from San Francisco to be here.
I did, and I actually left my jacket at the airport, and so I want to thank Ali for lending me a jacket. I appreciate that. And yes, we do call Stanford the farm, but I won't tell you what we call USC, so never mind. But no, thank you, Ali, and thank you, BizFed, for sponsoring me. Am I all right? Yeah. And okay, so I'll just tag you when I need it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience as it relates to, Ali's already talked about this, as it relates to sustainability, as it relates to the design of buildings, our building codes, and then some things that the USRC, in conjunction with Optimum Seismic and others, as part of the Seismic Resilience Initiative, are looking at the state level. Let's start by focusing on this difference between green design. I'm not calling it sustainable design for the reasons that Ali mentioned. Green design and resilient design. And the best example of this really comes from Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy. There were more green LEED certified buildings in the New York, New Jersey area at the time of Superstorm Sandy than anywhere else in the country. But that hurricane left a huge amount of damage in its wake. Over 300,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, billions of dollars of losses, and the number I like to focus on is over 10 million cubic yards of debris were generated. That debris has to be hauled off-site, which takes energy. It has to be stored in a landfill and degrades, which exposes the country to carbon emissions as the stuff degrades. And then it has to be replaced with 10 million cubic yards of new material. So the way I like to categorize the difference between green design and resilient design is green design focuses on our buildings having a low impact on the environment. But resilient design focuses on the environment having a low impact on our buildings. And that's what was missing with Superstorm Sandy. That's what the US Resiliency Council really is focusing on. Next slide. So the first thing to understand that a lot of folks don't understand is what it means to have a building built to code. If you ask most people and they say, well, my building is built to the latest code, they think it's earthquake-proof or hurricane-proof or flood-proof, that is somehow the definition of what the code provides. And really, that's not the case. The code is designed as a life safety document. It's designed to make sure that buildings don't collapse in a large disaster, whatever that hazard may be, but it's not necessarily intended to protect the asset, sometimes in the millions or tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, or the business continuity of what functions in that building. Could be, manufacturing, could be office space, could be a school, could be a grocery store. So this is an example of a building that performed according to the code. Now, you look at this building and it's a total wreck. It's going to have to be demolished. But it didn't collapse. People were able to get out of the building. And so when you ask yourself, is this building code compliant? Well, this was a large earthquake, and yes, the building was code compliant, but it's a total loss to the owner. If you go to the next slide, this was really made even more evident in the Christchurch earthquake in 2010 and 2011. They had what we would call the big ones, okay? They had two big ones. The biggest earthquake that you hear about in Los Angeles or San Francisco, that's what they had. They're smaller than our earthquakes, but for them it was the big one according to their design codes. And the good news is in the downtown area, only 2 buildings out of several thousand collapsed, 2 modern buildings, and most of the deaths there were in those 2 buildings. But there was so much damage that up to 70% of the buildings in the downtown area were eventually demolished and had to be replaced, leaving the downtown business district basically a ghost town. And so the question that everybody asks is, well, did the buildings meet performance expectations? If you talk to structural engineers, they said, well, these are the biggest earthquakes we're ever going to have in Christchurch. Only 2 buildings collapsed out of thousands. That was a major success when it comes to the code. But if you talk about the business owners that lost their buildings, lost their livelihoods, that people who had to move out and find other places to live or work, it was a complete catastrophe. And therein lies the key miscommunication between the public and the structural engineering community. That's what the US Resiliency Council is trying to bridge. Next slide. Now, we talk about buildings built to code, and when I mean built to code, we mean modern codes. We learn more about earthquakes every time there is one, and it's not like building a little widget that you can test 1,000,000 times in the lab. We certainly do testing of components of buildings and even large-scale testing, but it's minuscule compared to the number of buildings that are out there. So the fact of the matter is, every building in some sense or another is kind of a case study. And this is a map of Los Angeles, beautiful looking map, color-coded by the age of the buildings. And when I talk about modern codes, I'm talking about buildings on the 2 right-hand sides, the sort of the light pink and the orange. Okay? Everything else would be considered pre-modern code. And that's over 90% of the building stock in Los Angeles. Hate to say it. But it's no different in San Francisco. San Francisco map looks just the same. Portland, Seattle, all major cities look like this. Most of the buildings are there. They last 50, 60 years. And so we don't tear them down unless we have to. Buildings are replaced at an average of about 1% a year, so you can see how long it would take to replace all the old buildings. So when I talk about buildings that are life safe, meaning complying with modern codes, I'm just talking about even a small percentage of the buildings in most cities. Okay? Next slide. So one thing we can't get away from is that buildings are central to the performance of our communities. In whatever natural disaster. They form the basis of where we live, where we work, where we buy goods and services, where we transact business. And so each of you are here maybe representing a different sort of function of the community. Some are representing emergency response, some are representing business, some are representing city services and government. And those are all actually the real things that contribute to resilience, that make a city resilient, but they all have as a central key component the performance of buildings. So it's key that we as groups and different industries understand the performance of our buildings, 1, and 2, can find ways to make the performance of our building better to improve the resilience of all the services that go on in buildings. Next slide. So there have been a number of studies done at the national level, and actually a number within California as well, showing the benefits of mitigating buildings, retrofitting them, or designing buildings to higher performance levels, new buildings. That every dollar you spend investing in better performance or retrofitting a building can return $3, $4, $5, $6 in savings when it comes to the physical and economic losses that occur after a major disaster. And so, you know, one, if you think long-term about the building that you own or that you work in, there's a real benefit to investing in that building in the same way that you invest in your health, that you invest in, you know, insurance, that you invest in your house. You want to make it last a long time. But not everybody stays in one building for 20 years. But if you look at my previous slide, the reality is everybody stays in some building for 20 years, all right? And it doesn't matter if it's the one you were in 5 years ago. You know, it's like a game of hot potato. You're going to be somewhere when the earthquake strikes, you know. We don't strive for the point where we get so good in our careers that we work in a tent in the middle of a green field, right? I mean, we're always going to work in buildings. And so it's a community effort. It's an industry-wide effort to improve the performance of the buildings because it helps all of us when the earthquake strikes. Next slide. So, as Ali mentioned, several cities, many of them in Southern California, have implemented seismic awareness or retrofit or mitigation programs for different types of buildings. Primarily, those are unreinforced masonry buildings, but now there are several cities that have been doing soft story buildings. Of course, you're all going to be familiar with that in Southern California, since most of the cities are in SoCal that have been doing that. But also some non-ductile concrete buildings, which are another big kind of killer type building. And that represents, so what we've estimated is there are about 7 million residents in California that live in cities that have some ordinance or another. But there are really about 28 million residents in California that live in areas that we consider high seismic regions that need to be able to take advantage of these kind of ordinances as well. So this is Los Angeles. You probably see this is actually taken from the LA Times. This is a map of the apartment buildings that are categorized as soft story buildings just in Los Angeles. You can see there are thousands of them, but they're well on their way to retrofitting those and bringing them to be more safe. Other cities in the periphery of LA are also doing the same thing now, adopting these ordinances as well. Soft story buildings represent just one class of building that's vulnerable. I'll talk a little bit about some of the others in a minute. So the US Resiliency Council is a nonprofit. I started it with some other engineers back in 2011. It was really started as a response to almost that first slide I showed you, this idea that there's a difference between what the industry considered, quote, sustainable design and what engineers think of when we think of resilience. You can't, as Ali said, you can't really have true sustainability if your building can't survive a major disaster and you have to replace it. That sustainability really isn't in the long term. So we've developed a rating system for buildings. These are both for new and existing buildings. It's based on the latest engineering science when it comes to understanding building performance, along not just the dimensions of safety, which the code focuses on, but damage and recovery time, which are really the true measures of resilience when it comes to a community, a company, your family, school, whatever. And what we want to point out is that when we talk about code design, we're just talking about safety. And to get to resilience-based design, you have to consider all three dimensions. But what's more important to note is that the cost to achieve higher performance, especially for new buildings, is really a small fraction of the cost of the building. Maybe 0 to 5% in some cases. And I give this analogy that, you know, if you had an $80,000 Corvette and you drove it into a wall at 25 miles an hour, you'd probably walk away, okay? It's all got every safety feature you can imagine, all the airbags and everything else, and you'd probably survive it. But the car would be a total loss, right? But if for 1% of the cost of that car, for $800, you could still have a Corvette that looks like a Corvette and drives like a Corvette, but if you drove it into the wall, it'd be in the shop for 2 days and then you'd be back on the road. Wouldn't you spend that extra $800? And we're not talking about an $80,000 Corvette, we're talking about an $8 million building or an $80 million building. If you could spend 1% so that building would be functional within a couple days or a week or two after the earthquake, wouldn't you do it, as opposed to being a total loss? Next slide. Go back one. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so a couple examples. A building in up north near Roseville, near Sacramento, California, was recently designed to achieve the USRC's highest level of performance. It's a city building. It's a civic center / community college space. And it was just designed with thoughtful engineering, thoughtful architecture to achieve the highest rating at no additional cost. Building that's probably most of you will see at one point or another, Long Beach New City Hall, is being completed, and it too will achieve a high-level USRC rating at essentially no different cost than if it had been designed just to sort of meet the minimum requirements of the code. And so that's what we want to stress, is that it just takes thoughtful engineering working together with the architect and the building owner. You can achieve high performance by choosing the right structural system, by incorporating high-performing technologies. We have someone here from Taylor Devices who's a member of the US Resiliency Council. They've been a strong supporter. They make shock absorbers for your building, basically. And at a relatively low cost, they can absorb most of the energy from an earthquake and allow your building to perform in a way that, again, you can use it within a couple days or a couple weeks, which is a whole lot different than spending 3 years to rebuild the building after it's been destroyed. Next slide. This is an example. Ali talked about affordable housing. Affordable housing is a crucial issue everywhere in California. In San Francisco, they don't have enough of it either. This new building just broke ground, and it's going to be a concrete building, affordable housing. Half of the population here will be low-income seniors. I think 25% of them were formerly homeless seniors. This building is going to achieve a gold rating, probably the highest rating that a multifamily housing a unit would achieve so far in the state. And again, virtually no extra cost because of thoughtful engineering, a thoughtful structural system that was used. This actually uses a damper in the foundation of the building, believe it or not, underneath the footing. So it can be done. It just has to be a thoughtful discussion when the construction starts, or when the design starts, rather, with the whole design team. Next slide. So what does this mean in terms of our communities? Well, as buildings are designed to higher levels of performance, either new buildings or existing buildings are retrofitted, we can start to look at what types of buildings, what types of services we want to perform particularly well. Okay, we all know that hospitals and schools are right at the top of our list, but affordable housing is a key component. We don't want to provide so much, just be throwing affordable housing out there so quickly that after an earthquake, it all renders people homeless anyways. Grocery stores, things like that, food distribution, it's all key. Once you start to do this with a city and make a real plan for resilience, you can start to look at where you are in terms of key service sectors after an earthquake. And you can come up with strategies that will improve the performance of your key services. So that's what the USRC is doing, working with cities to try and implement those strategies. Next slide. So then let me talk with you really briefly about the Seismic Resilience Initiative. Ali mentioned it. This was sort of a group of volunteers that kind of got together last October to think about what kind of policies statewide would be beneficial to improving resilience. And what we came up with was it all starts with information. It all starts with giving cities information on the types of buildings that they have so that they can make decisions that are appropriate for themselves about long-term strategies. What's good for Pasadena is going to be different than Rancho Cucamonga, is going to be different than Fremont, it's going to be different from Redding. Okay? Each city has its own special needs and constraints and opportunities, but it all starts with information. So that's what the Seismic Resilience Initiative, and now AB 2681, which gets a vote on the assembly in about 3 hours, is focused on. Next slide. It looks at the most vulnerable types of buildings we have in the state. We all know about unreinforced masonry. Most of us now are familiar with the concept of soft-story buildings, but it also looks at older concrete structures, tilt-ups, older steel frame buildings, buildings that were designed, as I showed you in that map of Los Angeles, before we'd consider modern codes that can be upgraded to perform better, to protect the lives of the people inside, and also even to protect the building assets themselves. Next slide. So ultimately, the SRI, the Seismic Resilience Initiative, and AB 2681 will create an inventory of these types of buildings statewide in areas of high seismicity. So those 28 million people that I showed you in that map that were, living in areas of high seismicity, those cities will know where their vulnerable buildings are. And then it will allow owners to evaluate their buildings to see if they really, should be on the list, or look at ways that they can get off the list through mitigation or future analysis. But most importantly, it will give cities tools and data to be able to come up with their own long-term mitigation ordinances and plans. Next slide. So Elise said this, the USRC's goal is to complement the idea of green design. We are all in favor of environmentally friendly design, but they're really two sides of the same coin. There's green design, which protects the environment. There's resilient design, which protects our communities and our buildings. And that's what we want to join together. Next slide. So last thing is a pitch to join the USRC. We're a nonprofit. We'd love to have you all as members. As I said, Taylor and Optimum Seismic are two of our strong supporters, and we appreciate that. But the more members we have, the more opportunities we have to get the word out, spread the word, make the case for resilient design. So I think that was my last slide.